All right, so have you ever felt like international law is this thing happening way out there, like in some official building and nothing to do with you? Well, today we're going to try to change that because we're going on a deep dive into a treaty that might surprise you.
Hmm. Intriguing. Tell me more.
It's called the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination.
Okay.
Catchy, right?
It is. It is.
But we'll call it ICERD for short.
Makes sense.
So trust me on this one. This isn't just some old document gathering dust.
No. No, definitely not. ICERD is surprisingly relevant, even today. More than ever, I'd say.
Right. Okay, so rewind with me for a sec. Back to 1965. It's the 60s. The world's, still kind of recovering from World War II. The horrors of the Holocaust are still fresh in everyone's minds. And you've got all these new countries popping up, especially in Africa, finally free from colonialism. So what does all of this have to do with a treaty that we're talking about that was written over 50 years ago?
Well, you have to imagine being a brand new country.
Yeah.
You've seen firsthand what discrimination can lead to, and you want something different for your people and for the world.
Right, like we've learned from our mistakes. We've got to do better.
Exactly. So they wanted to make sure that the world actually learned from the terrible things that had happened. These new countries were determined to make equality a core part of international law, and not just a nice idea, right?
Right, because a handshake only goes so far.
Exactly. They saw the United Nations, which was also relatively new at the time, as the perfect way to make this happen.
Makes sense.
And that's really where ICERD was born, from this incredible moment in history. It was this super ambitious plan to eliminate racial discrimination everywhere, like in all corners of the world, and
Yeah.
they wanted it to be legally binding.
Wow, so they got together and said, let's make this real.
Yeah, exactly. They were serious about it,
Wow.
and they made it happen.
Okay, so they created this treaty, but like, how does it impact you?
That's the big question, right?
Yeah.
It's all well and good to have these documents, but what do they actually mean in the real world?
Exactly. So let's get into ICERD and see what it says.
Okay.
First off, it defines racial discrimination, and this is important.
Yeah.
It's not just about like those overt in-your-face things that are super obvious.
Right. It goes deeper than that.
Yeah, it's the sneaky ways bias gets into laws and policies, even just like everyday interactions.
Yeah, it's about understanding that discrimination isn't always like a smack in the face. Sometimes it's way more subtle than that, but it can be just as harmful, maybe even more so.
Yeah, it's like that whole intent versus impact thing.
Exactly.
So important.
And, a lot of times the impact is completely unintentional, which makes it harder to see, but no less important to address.
Totally. And you know me, I love a good example.
Okay, let's hear it.
Let's say you're trying to get a loan, right? On paper, everyone with the same credit score should qualify.
Right.
But what if, because of like where you live or your background, you haven't had the same opportunities as someone else?
I see where you're going with this.
Yeah, that impacts your credit score. And then that equal loan system isn't actually equal at all.
That's a really good point. And that's what ICERD is trying to get at. It's not just about treating everyone the same in the moment. It's about looking at the historical context, at the systemic barriers that might be at play.
It's like leveling the playing field for real, not just pretending it's level when it's not.
Exactly. And it doesn't just tell countries, don't discriminate. ICERD goes beyond that. It actually requires them to actively work towards equality. It calls for what it calls special measures to make things fairer.
Special measure? Okay, help me out here. What does that even mean in, like, real life?
Sure. So think about like university admissions. A university might have a special scholarship program specifically for students from backgrounds that have historically been excluded. Now, some people might look at that and say that's reverse discrimination, but that's not really what ICERD is about. It's about understanding that the playing field hasn't always been level. So we need to do things differently, at least for a while, to even things out.
It's like in a race, if someone's been forced to wear ankle weights their whole life, you can't just suddenly yell, go, and expect a fair competition, right?
Exactly. You've got to remove those ankle weights, metaphorically speaking, give everyone a fair shot from the starting line.
Right. Makes sense.
And that's where data comes in. You can't fix a problem if you don't know the extent of it, right? ICERD stresses the importance of collecting data on things like race and ethnicity, because that's the only way to really see where the disparities are and then try to fix them.
Right, because you can't fix what you don't measure.
Exactly. It's about shining a light on those inequalities, not pretending they don't exist.
Speaking of things we need to shine a light on, hate speech.
Yeah.
Feels like it's everywhere these days, especially online.
It's true. The internet, especially social media, has made it really easy to spread hate. And the thing about ICERD is it doesn't shy away from these difficult topics. It actually confronts them head on.
But that's tricky, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Because you have freedom of speech, but then you also have hate speech. So how do you balance those two? Feels like walking a tightrope.
It is a tightrope walk.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what ICERD tries to grapple with. On the one hand, the treaty encourages countries to strongly condemn hate speech and even to make it illegal, especially if it's inciting violence.
Right.
But, and this is a big but, they also make it clear that this needs to be done in a way that respects everyone's right to freedom of expression. It's about finding that balance.
So it's kind of like saying you can't just shout fire in a crowded theater or, spread dangerous lies and incite violence and then hide behind freedom of speech.
Exactly. It's not a free pass to be hateful.
Right, right.
And what's interesting is that ICERD goes even further than that. It doesn't just try to react to hate speech after it's happened. It emphasizes the importance of preventing it in the first place.
Oh, okay. So how do you do that?
Well, a big part of it is education.
Yes, I am all about that. Teach people to be better humans from a young age.
Right. It's about starting early. ICERD calls on countries to promote tolerance and understanding between different cultures to really get to the root of prejudice.
That makes sense. You catch more flies with honey than vinegar, right? Sometimes education is more powerful than punishment.
100%, because it's about changing hearts and minds, not just punishing people after they've done something wrong.
Love it. Okay, so we've talked about what ICERD is trying to do. So we've got this ambitious treaty trying to tackle all these huge issues. But, gotta be honest, it was signed back in the 60s.
Right. A while ago.
Does it still, hold up in today's world?
That's a really common question, actually.
Mm.
And I think it's one of the things that makes ICERD so interesting. You're right. For a while, it did kind of fade into the background a bit. The fight against apartheid in South Africa was such a huge focus for so long, and rightly so, but I think ICERD got overshadowed a bit. But then a big shift happened, the 2001 Durban Conference.
Okay, Durban Conference, yeah. Remind me what made that so important.
So basically, it was this global summit where, for the first time, countries really acknowledged that racism was not a thing of the past. They made it clear that even though we had seen the end of colonialism and apartheid, racism was still a massive global problem that needed serious attention.
So it's like they were saying, okay, yeah, those were big wins, getting rid of those systems, but that doesn't mean we're done.
Exactly. The work wasn't finished. And the really cool thing is that ICERD, even though it was written decades before this, was flexible enough to keep up. That's why it's often called a living convention.
Okay, I like that. Living convention, because it's adaptable. So we're talking about things like racial profiling, online hate speech, even the fact that, climate change often hits marginalized communities the hardest.
Exactly. All those things. The principles of ICERD are really about the core of equality. It doesn't matter if it's 1965 or 2024. Those principles still apply.
Mind-blowing. So how does a treaty written before the internet existed even begin to deal with something as complex as online hate speech?
Because it goes back to those core principles of equality and non-discrimination. Remember we talked about how sometimes you need those special measures to even the playing field? Well, think about it like this tackling online hate speech. That's a special measure for the digital age.
Ah, okay. So we're saying social media companies need to step up, take responsibility for what's happening on their platform.
Precisely. And I'm not just talking about taking down hateful content after it's already out there. It's about creating systems that stop it from spreading in the first place.
Which, makes sense because we talked about how ICERD emphasizes education in the real world. We need that same approach in the digital one, right?
Exactly. Be proactive.
Yeah.
And this is where it gets even more interesting. Back in 2019, there was this landmark case involved Palestine and Israel. It really showed how much power ICERD has.
Okay, Palestine and Israel, that's a complex situation, to say the least.
Yeah, it definitely is. But basically what happened was Palestine filed something called an interstate communication against Israel. They filed it with the committee that oversees ICERD.
In-state communication sounds intense. What does that even mean?
So it's a way for one country to hold another accountable for violating a treaty. Think of it like taking a complaint to the ICERD court, although it's not really a court in the traditional sense.
Gotcha. Okay.
And this case was a big deal because it was only the third time in history anything like this had happened.
Wow, third time ever. No pressure. Palestine. So what happened?
Well, Israel tried to argue that the committee didn't actually have the authority to rule on the case.
Okay.
Their argument was that they didn't officially recognize Palestine as a state.
Yeah.
But the committee, they came back with this really powerful counterargument. And it was all about how the prohibition against racial discrimination is what's called a just cogence norm.
Just cogents. Okay, you're going to have to break that one down for me.
Sure, yeah. It sounds very official. But basically, it means that there are some things that are so fundamentally wrong, so universally condemned, that they are considered a kind of moral law that applies to everyone. It transcends individual states, you know? It doesn't matter if a country has actually signed a treaty or not. They're still bound by these core principles. It's like saying you don't get to pick and choose when it comes to basic human rights.
Powerful stuff. So what was the final word? Did ICERD make an actual difference?
It did. The committee's decision sent a very strong message. They said basically that you can't just cherry pick which countries you want to recognize when it comes to human rights. The fight against racism requires a global effort. Everyone has to be on board.
That's amazing. So even though, yeah, ICERD might be an older treaty, it clearly still carries a lot of weight.
Oh, absolutely. And that's what makes it so relevant, I think. It's not just some abstract document gathering dust, you know.
Right.
It's really a testament to the fight for equality, which is still going on.
Mm.
And it's something that we all have to be a part of.
I love that. This has been eye-opening. We started by asking, how does this treaty, written over 50 years ago, have anything to do with me today? But it turns out it's woven into so many parts of our lives, like from education to online spaces to even international relations. Crazy.
Yeah, and it's a really important reminder that the fight for racial justice isn't even close to being over.
Mm.
It's something that we all have a stake in. We have to hold each other accountable and keep working towards a world that's truly equitable.
Couldn't agree more. All right, so there you have it. That was our deep dive into ICERD, a treaty that, like we said, more relevant than ever. Hope this has given you some things to think about, maybe a new way of looking at things, and who knows, maybe you'll even be inspired to get involved and make a difference.